In topic 20, we're going to talk about the next big challenge that comes really to Christianity at this point, not just to the Roman Catholic Church, but also to all of these different Protestant groups. But there's some background to this, and where this is all leading is to the European Enlightenments, where reason will suddenly start challenging faith, or science and philosophy will start challenging theology. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, there really weren't any choices if you were living in Europe. You were either Roman Catholic or you weren't Roman Catholic. That was it. And even if you weren't Roman Catholic, you probably didn't make that big of a deal about not being Roman Catholic because everybody was just Catholic. That was your choice. So there was this kind of seamless garment that ran through the medieval period all the way down to the 30 Years' War, which we'll talk about here in a second. But when Luther comes along, and I've pointed this out before, you start to see a major challenge to the Roman Catholic Church that actually shows it may not be as powerful as people believed it to be. And so there are certain things that Luther does to the church that have unintended consequences. And as I've already pointed out, if you're going to question the church, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to start questioning monarchies. And the next thing you're going to do is you're going to start questioning religion in general, and you're going to start questioning God. Now, these aren't things Luther ever meant to happen, but unfortunately they are things that are consequences of Luther questioning the power of the church and succeeding with that question. We're also in a period of time in which there's nationalism on the rise, nation states, and nation building. You can't anymore think of yourself as just being under the power of the Holy Roman Empire or being under the Holy Roman Emperor. You don't think of yourself in that context anymore. You're starting to think of yourself as belonging to Germany, belonging to France, belonging to England. And so you have nationalism, you have patriotism, and these ideas are really issuing a challenge, and that challenge is simply, what is your ultimate allegiance? Is your ultimate allegiance to the church, or is your ultimate allegiance to the nation? And there's a lot of confusion here right before the time of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and during the time and after the Protestant Reformation of where is your loyalty? Is it to king and queen? Is it to king and country? Or is it to the Pope? And different people have different answers to that challenge and to that question. Some are saying the church, some are saying the nation. Others will say, no, my allegiance is to myself, to my mind, to science, those sorts of things. If you remember, I pointed out with Melanchthon that the Peace of Augsburg was signed in 1555. And this was an attempt at détente. This was an attempt at stopping the violence going on between Roman Catholics and Lutherans. And the idea was basically, if you lived in an area that was ruled by a Roman Catholic monarch, then that was the official religion of that land. If you lived in a region that was ruled by a Protestant monarch, then that was the official religion of that land. This worked for a while, but everybody knew it wasn't the permanent solution to this split between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Protestantism had this tendency to really fragment European society, both religiously and politically. And this was something that Europe hadn't had to deal with, particularly throughout the Middle Ages, because again, there was just this one church, the Roman Catholic Church. So when Protestantism comes along, you start to see the breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire. Again, people are no longer thinking of themselves as belonging to this larger empire. They're thinking of themselves as individuals, as belonging to certain nations and nation states. And remember, one of the big things that the Protestant Reformation brings with it is this concept of individualism. If I don't need the church for salvation, if I am simply saved by the grace of God, then that puts the emphasis on the individual more than it does on the empire, on the church, etc. Well, the Peace of Augsburg only lasts for so long because between the years 1618 and 1648, so in the 17th century, you get the 30 Years' War. Why is it called the 30 Years' War? Not trying to be so sarcastic here, but obviously, as you can see from the years, it lasted 30 years. And this was a horrible time in European history because the 30 Years' War is a war in which Christians are fighting Christians, Protestants are fighting Catholics, and they're fighting each other for who will be the dominant force, the dominant religious force in Europe. And essentially you have then a Protestant Union and a Catholic League that end up fighting one another. This is similar to what has happened in Northern Ireland. And this is, a lot of individuals look at this and say, wait a minute, how can two different groups that are followers of Jesus end up fighting with one another? Well, what's going on here, and I'm not trying to downplay the atrocities of this, is both sides are fighting for religious supremacy in Europe. And they're doing this not just on a religious level, but on a social and a political level. After the 30 Years' War, we get in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia. And what the Peace of Westphalia says is it says that rulers cannot impose her or his religion. A ruler can't impose his or her religion on a group of people. If the ruler happens to be Catholic, they cannot insist that every subject to the crown is Catholic. If the ruler happens to be Protestant, same thing. The ruler can't insist that everyone be Protestant. This also meant that the ruler, the monarch, or even the government could not regulate could regulate public worship, but could not regulate private worship. So you might have an official state religion, like Anglicanism, but you couldn't then turn around and say, all right, people can no longer go to Catholic Mass. And this was essentially a compromise, the Peace of Westphalia, between Roman Catholics, between Lutherans, and Calvinists, in which the idea was just simply, we are all going to try and get along. Rulers can be what they are. There can be a public, official church for a region or for a state, but you cannot regulate the private worship practices of people that are under your rule and reign. All of this sets the stage for something that's going to end up challenging not just Roman Catholicism, but all the different branches of Protestantism. After seeing all of these problems with Roman Catholics and Protestants, the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, Augsburg, all this sort of stuff, a lot of individuals began to wonder, is the problem religion itself? Is the problem faith itself? And here we enter into the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution is a very different way of looking at the world. And it doesn't look at the world through the lens of the Bible, and it doesn't look at the world through the lens of faith. It looks at the world through things like physics, biology, geology, etc. It looks at the world through a scientific lens, the lens of reason. Now, this is often caricatured as finally the Enlightenment shows up and fights off the superstitions of the Dark Ages. But that's not really what's going on here, because in reality, the scientific revolution has its roots in the humanism that was being taught in Catholic universities throughout Europe in the medieval period. And one of the big questions has been, is there really as much conflict here between science and religion as people think? And the answer to that is yes and no. But today, a lot of this conflict has been solved where the Roman Catholic Church itself, being both and, accepts both science and faith together, or reason and faith working together. And if you remember, this is an idea that goes all the way back to the great theologian of Roman Catholicism, Thomas Aquinas. But the roots of the scientific revolution start with Copernicus, whose years are 1473 to 1543. Copernicus was a Dutch priest. And because of his vast knowledge of the Greco-Roman world, he believed in the Greco-Roman world's understanding of a heliocentric universe. If you believe in heliocentrism, you believe that the Earth revolves around the sun, as opposed to a geocentric universe in which everything else in the universe revolves around the Earth. Now, the church had taught for some time that the Earth is the center of the universe, not the sun. But Copernicus questioned that and said, no, the Greeks and the Romans are right on this, that the sun is the center of the universe. And he bases this on Greco-Roman philosophy and scientific knowledge. Now, this isn't really that big of a deal for people living in the 21st century because we all accept a heliocentric model. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church today accepts a heliocentric model. But this starts something, because this starts this use of science and philosophy to question what the established authority, the Roman Catholic Church, had been saying for such a long time. And the real person who gets in trouble with this is Galileo, whose years are 1564 to 1642. Galileo comes along following Copernicus and says the church shouldn't be in the business of science and science shouldn't be in the business of religion. Now, that is a classic either-or statement. That is not a both-and statement. And today, the Roman Catholic Church would say that no, religion and science are compatible with one another. They can teach one another. They can work with one another. But there are a lot of scientists, of course, today who would agree with this statement that religion should have nothing to do with science, and religion should have nothing to do with science, and science should have nothing to do with religion, or that science should even replace religion. Well, Galileo got in all kinds of trouble. Part of why he got in trouble wasn't so much for talking about a heliocentric universe and the ideas of Copernicus, but he got in trouble because he questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation. But he was placed under house arrest, and eventually he was forced to admit that the Earth is actually the center of the universe, although if you read his journals and diaries, you realize very quickly that he knows he's lying when he does this. And this was a very unfortunate black spot in the history of the Catholic Church, because this is why a lot of people, even down to this day, think the Roman Catholic Church is anti-science, because it condemned Galileo. But John Paul II in the 20th century reversed the case against Galileo and said that the case was absolutely absurd, that it was wrong, and that the charges against Galileo should be dropped. Here's an image of Galileo for you. But Galileo and Copernicus, even with something so simple as questioning, is the Earth the center of the universe or is it the sun, and coming to the conclusion that it's the sun when the church had been teaching that it's the Earth, starts this whole pattern of, can science teach us something that religion cannot teach us? And is science right, or is religion right? A couple other big names that come out of the scientific revolution and all of these various enlightenments that are going on in Europe. The really big name here is René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Descartes coins this famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin is Latin, and it means I think, therefore I am. And this is a statement well worth remembering, cogito ergo sum, because it's almost kind of the slogan of the scientific revolution and all of these different European enlightenments that will come about. I think, therefore I am is a statement that in many respects means I know I'm alive, I know I'm human, because I think. I'm cognizant of my own thoughts. Now, that may not seem like that big of a deal to people today, except what you're saying with that, in a sense, is saying, I know who I am because of reason, not because of faith. I know who I am because I am a thinking, rational human being. It isn't because I'm made in the image of God. And of course, what happens with a statement like this is that it suddenly means the mind is the most important thing. Maybe the mind, maybe reason, maybe thinking is what can in fact save us, not faith, not religion. Following with this was a man named David Hume, 1711 to 1776. And again, if you look at this date, 1776, that's an obvious date for many Americans. And people sometimes forget that the American Revolution and many of the founding fathers of the United States were part of this scientific revolution. They were part of this Enlightenment tradition. But David Hume coined the term empiricism. Empiricism is this idea coming out of Scotland that you only can believe the things that you have experienced firsthand. And if you haven't experienced it, then it's not true. Now, again, many of us might agree with that. It's so simple as saying something like, I don't believe in ghosts because I have never seen a ghost. Or I don't believe in aliens and UFOs because I've never seen an alien or a UFO. The only reality that is true is the reality I have actually experienced. Well, empiricism actually creates a number of problems for Protestants and Catholics because it critiques religion. And it says things like, well, I have never seen a person raised from the dead. So, is it really then possible that Jesus rose from the dead? I have never seen a miracle take place. So therefore, are miracles true? I have never seen a demon. I've never seen an angel. I've never seen somebody exorcise of demons. So if I've never experienced this or seen it, then I have to say it's not true. And here's a picture of David Hume. At the same time, we have individuals like Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, talking about the importance philosophically of reason, of logic, and of scientific proof. And if you can't prove something using science, logic, rationalism, if you will, then you have to say, much like Hume, that it isn't real. Now, all of these things are eventually going to start impacting, if they aren't already, the traditional teachings of not just the Roman Catholic Church, but also of things you find in the Bible. One individual in particular who's going to enter into this picture from 1804 to 1872 is a man named Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach had a profound impact on the thinking of Karl Marx and on many other thinkers in this period. In fact, if you wanted to move to the anti-God side, Feuerbach is the person you listen to. Feuerbach is the father of modern atheism. And he came up with this idea that Sigmund Freud, as a psychoanalyst, would later follow. But Feuerbach came up with this whole idea that what human beings are actually calling God isn't God at all. It's just simply a projection of things that human beings wish human beings would actually be, and then they project that idea out there into the universe and call it God. In other words, Feuerbach would say, when human beings talk about God as a God of justice or a God of the poor or a God of love, etc., all that really tells you is that's what one human being wishes other human beings valued. And then they project it out there in the universe to say that's what God is. And what human beings are saying God is really doesn't tell you anything about God. It tells you what human beings want. So if I say things like, I believe God is a God of love, a God of justice, a God of inclusion, all of that is really what I wish human beings were all about. And again, this was picked up on later by Sigmund Freud, and Freud used this as part of his psychoanalytic method, saying that people who believe in God are being irrational because what they're doing is they're not really talking about God. They're using God as a coping mechanism to deal with the failings of humanity. And then, of course, we have Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, 1809 to 1882. Darwin is a very, very misunderstood individual, but is not liked, certainly by some conservative Christians, today and is embraced by others. But Darwin really presents a gigantic challenge to both Protestants and Catholics, because one of the things Darwin starts talking about is the evolution of the species, natural selection, all those sorts of things. The problem that Darwin presents both for Protestants and for Catholics is that if he is right, it means the Earth is much older than 6,000 years, which the Church had been teaching since the medieval period, and it means the Bible, with its creation story, in which the Earth is created in 6 days with God resting on the seventh, can't be right if you take it literally. And so for some Christian groups today, usually fundamentalist Christians in the United States, Darwin is this very evil individual, and this is really science versus religion, with Darwin and his theories of evolution versus what both Protestants and Roman Catholics were teaching at this time period, that you can trust the Bible, you can trust what it has to say about the creation of the world, and individuals like Darwin come along and say this is not how this works. The Earth is older than we thought, and it cannot have been created in 6 days, and that there is this process of evolution that goes on over millions of years. It's not just God one day creating human beings as the first species on Earth, and so on and so forth. Now, there are individuals that are religious, that hold on to their religious tradition, that also embrace the scientific revolution. One individual in particular is Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662. Holding on to religion, Pascal suggests that even though we have to accept many of the ideas of science and mathematics and philosophy, that there are reasons of the heart, he says, which reason isn't aware of. And what he means by this is there are still things out there that we cannot comprehend, that we cannot understand by reason alone. In other words, he's trying to have this both and perspective on things. If I'm going to accept a lot of the ideas of the scientific revolution, but at the same time, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm still going to believe in church teaching and in church tradition. But Pascal was certainly an anomaly in all of this. And then we also get, during the scientific revolution, the rise of a new kind of belief in God, which comes about with Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727. Newton is really the example of a deist. And most historians today of early American history are convinced that many of the early founding fathers of the United States were deists. If you're a deist, you do believe that there is an all-powerful God in the universe. But you view that God as a kind of big watchmaker. It's a God that isn't a personal God. It's a God that created the world, wound it all up like a watch, and now is watching it tick down to its end. And so there is a God, there is a higher power, but it's not a personal God. It's definitely not the God of Christianity that's a trinity of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You're not denying the existence of God or denying the existence of a higher power, but you see that God as the watchmaker who's more distant. And of course, this is a radical rethinking of the God that both Protestants and Catholics talk about. We also have John Locke, 1632 to 1704, who's very important for the philosophy that created American history. If you ever read the Declaration of Independence, you should have the Declaration in one hand and the writings of John Locke in another hand, because some will tell you that Jefferson basically plagiarized from John Locke. The idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes right from John Locke, but most Americans know it as coming from the hands of Thomas Jefferson. Locke is also an individual that tries to hold on to some parts of Christianity. He writes a text called The Reasonableness of Christianity, in which he tries to argue that Christianity can be reconciled with both logic and reason, that there is a rational approach to Christianity that helps to make sense out of Christianity. And then there is George Hegel, 1770 to 1832. He tries to say back to more radical individuals who are part of the Enlightenment, part of the scientific revolution, that you can synthesize in a both-and sort of way nature and grace. Nature and grace, science, faith, reason, do not have to be opposed to one another. He can point to things like Jesus being human and divine. He can talk about the fact that we are human beings but created in the image of God as a reason why nature and grace do not have to be opposed to one another. So he points out that this world and the next world, the world to come, are not in competition with one another, but they can work with one another. And Hegel, George Hegel here, in many respects, is repeating ideas that go back to the time of Thomas Aquinas. But all of these individuals, and I'm just giving you a smattering of them, do in their own way, shape, and form show that the world is changing. And that as science is on the rise, faith is now being questioned. And if you think about this, this makes perfect, complete sense, because the problem a lot of people are having with the church is that the church, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or the churches of Protestantism, have led to all of these problems in Europe, like the 30 Years' War. And so it was simply inevitable for somebody to come along and say, wait a minute, we've questioned the Roman Catholic Church, we've questioned the power of monarchs, so should we now go and question God himself, or should we question religion itself? Should we look to ourselves as human beings for other answers? Now, that line of thinking works quite well until you get into the early part of the 20th century and start seeing World War I and World War II. And then people will wonder, did we put too much faith in humanity? Did we put too much faith in science? But what we have here during the time of the scientific revolution and the various European enlightenments, whether they're in England or France, Germany, is the world of Europe, and even the creation of the United States during this period of time, the European world is becoming much more secular. Whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic, religion isn't as important as it once was. Instead of a both-and approach, more and more people are taking a this worldly world approach, that what really matters is the world we live in now. So the question becomes, how does the church, both Protestant churches and Roman Catholic churches, how do they remain relevant in all of this? We're going to talk about this in the next lecture. But with the rise of secularization comes the rise of liberalism. Liberalism is simply a word that means to be free to operate, free to think as you will. I know liberalism has all kinds of strange connotations to it today because it has slightly different meanings in American politics, but the idea here is that now that people are free to operate and they're free to think for themselves, what's the point of Christianity? What's the point of God? What's the point of a church like the Roman Catholic Church with its hierarchy? And of course, all of these churches are going to be left with different kinds of responses to the scientific revolution and to secularization. Interestingly, Protestant churches are going to be better at embracing, at first, this secularization. It will take the Catholic Church into the 20th century to embrace this. The Catholic Church is really going to resist this secularization process. But that question that kind of has been with us for a long time now is foremost in the minds of a lot of Catholics. Does allegiance to the church anymore equal allegiance to the Pope? How do you be faithful to the church and to the Pope, but also be faithful to the nation of France, to the nation of England, to scientific thought? How do you hold all of this together? And as I said, the reactions to this are very, very different. And in many respects, the Catholic Church takes the position of fight back and retreat.